Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Reggie Blanding. I'm a librarian here in the James Brown African American Room. On behalf of our interim director, Ingrid Betancourt, and Board of Trustees President, Dr. Lauren Wells, we thank you all for joining us for our 2023 commemorative Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. lecture. We are beyond honored to welcome this year's lecturer, Kenneth B. Morris Jr. Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape First Nations, on which we are learning, laboring, and organizing today. We also recognize the devastation and continued legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, which contributed to present-day systemic racism and oppression. It is equally important to acknowledge and pay our utmost respect to those who have fought and continue to fight against injustice in its various forms. So on a weekend like this, we definitely want to acknowledge those leading the fight from the classrooms and streets and beyond. A little about this space for anyone who may be joining us for the first time. This space was named in honor of the late James Library Brown, an influential activist, poet, and librarian who was instrumental in ensuring the library curated materials and presented programs that examined and celebrated the African-American experience. Mr. Brown was committed to encouraging Newark youth to pursue education and to understand the importance of the library's role in their academic growth. I want to commend and thank several of my colleagues here in the James Brown Room, whose excellent work is absolutely integral in continuing Mr. Brown's vision. Some of you may have gotten some drinks from Alicia Grant off to the side here. Alicia Grant, Austin Williams, and our interim head of special collections, Dale Colston, Esquire. I could not ask for better coattails to ride, so y'all make me look good, thank you. I'm also thankful for many of our colleagues here at the Newark Public Library. Too many to name, we are limited on time, but IT, maintenance staff, development, etc. Thank you all for your assistance and the work that y'all do. Last but absolutely not least, I want to our sincere gratitude for the Philip Roth Endowment, Friends of James Brown African American Room, and our amazing friends and neighbors at the Newark Museum of Art in Rutgers, Newark, who helped make today's event possible. We are truly blessed to have them in our corner. I especially want to spotlight Dr. Sylvia Fantoni, Deputy Director of Learning and Engagement at the Newark Museum of Art, and Christina Strasburger, Department Administrator of History and Africana Studies at Rutgers, Newark, both for their tireless efforts in not only helping to bring this program to fruition, but continual support throughout the years. Relentless support. Even now, I think out the corner of my eye, I can see Christina saying, "Do you need anything?" I'm giving you a break for now, but appreciate all your help over the years and ongoing assistance and just support. So, and thank you all for showing up today on this cold day for what I know is going to be an amazing talk. So if you'll join me in welcoming Newark Public Library's Interim Director, Ingrid Betancourt.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this absolutely beautiful space in this absolutely gorgeously cold day. We really appreciate all of you who joined us here this afternoon. On behalf of the staff of the Newark Public Library, I welcome all of you to our Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. commemorative lecture today. For several decades, the Newark Library has been bringing different voices and different viewpoints that inspire and remind us to support the work and the dreams of Dr. King. At the Newark Public Library, the MLK Lecture is the inaugural event of each year's Black History celebration. We are honored that Mr. Morris, a man who is committed to his family's mission of educating people about still existing slavery, will be speaking to us today. We are especially grateful to the Philip Roth Endowment, to the Friends of the James Brown African American Room, the Newark Museum of Art, and Rutgers University, Newark, Department of History and Africana Studies for their generous support of this lecture. My colleague Reggie already recognized some of the folks who are joining us today. I'd like to also recognize Chancellor of Rutgers University, Newark, Nancy Cantor, and her team. Thank you for joining us. And of course, also Dr. Anas Amat, a member of the Board of Trustees of the Newark Public Library and a founding member of the Friends of Jabbar. Dr. Amat. It is programs such as these that reinforce the importance of public libraries and why libraries are more critical today than ever. This building and our branches throughout the city are safe places to gather, to learn, to expand horizons, and to be entertained. It is where you can find a book that makes you laugh, use a computer or printer, expand your business through the technology and services offered at our makerspace, and encourage your children to make reading an essential part of their lives. Whether you visit in person, whether you borrow audiobooks and movies from our rich offerings of digital resources, whether you reach out and contact our reference librarians through text or email or phone, or with your questions, looking for the right answer, or whether you come in person to visit our on-staff social worker, NPL, the Newark Public Library, is your trusted destination. So now it is my pleasure, my great pleasure, to introduce Dr. Domingo Morel, who is the Vice President of the Newark Public Library Board of Trustees. Dr. Morel is Associate Professor of Political Science and Public Service at the NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. He received his PhD in political science from Brown University in 2014. Dr. Morel is the author of Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy, published in 2018 by Oxford University Press, which won the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award. Please join me in giving Dr. Morel a warm welcome to the podium.
Hello, everyone. I asked Ingrid not to say all of that, but we're here. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of the Newark Public Library, we want to welcome you to our annual Dr. King Commemorative Lecture. Dr. Anas Amat, one of our board members, is here. Dr. Lauren Wells, the president of the Board of Trustees, couldn't be here today, so she sends her regrets. But as we get prepared to listen to his wonderful lecture, as Ingrid had mentioned, the public library is a space for all of the wonderful things that she indicated. And I think this is an important opportunity for us to reflect on what a public library and a public space means, right? And not just a public space and not just a public library, but a public library in the city of Newark. Because what we do in the city of Newark is not just for the city of Newark, the whole nation sees what happens here. It's what brought Mr. Morris's great-great-great-grandfather, Frederick Douglass, to Newark in 1849 to fight abolition, right? It's what brought Dr. King to Newark just a couple of days before his assassination in 1968 to fight against poverty. And so they recognized the importance of coming to Newark and the public space and the public institutions in Newark as a way not just to address the systemic injustices, racism in Newark, but across the country. And so as we reflect on that, we have to reflect on our own public institutions here and the importance of our public institutions. Because I think all too often we forget that we have to continue to fight for these public spaces and these public institutions. Right now, as we speak, in that same neighborhood where Dr. King came in 1968, Clinton Hill, that community doesn't have a library branch open. The Clinton branch is closed because the facilities are not up to standards. Now, as a board, as a staff, we are committed to making sure that this building is open, but not just open. That when it is open, that it is the type of library that that community deserves and that the city of Newark deserves. But we can't do that on our own. We need each and every one of you to support us, to talk to your city council members, to talk to the mayor, to talk to the community organizations, to talk to the business community, saying that this is not acceptable, right? And so we all need to come collectively in public spaces like these and other places to make sure that we're fighting not just for Clinton Branch, but for all of the public institutions in the city of Newark. So with that said, this time I would like to introduce Irene Daniels, who is not only a founding member of the Friends of the James Brown African American Room here in our library, but continues to be an executive board member, to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Morris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Morrell. Good afternoon, everyone. Isn't this a beautiful room? This is the James Brown African American Room. And as mentioned earlier, it was named after James Brown, who was a librarian in the African American Room. And in 2016, Dr. Anasa Ma'at, I can keep hearing that name, right? She formed the Friends of the James Brown African American Room. She said, we must continue the work of James Brown. So she formed the Friends of the James Brown African American Room. Thank you, Dr. Ma'at. It's comprised of community activists, artists, art administrators, educators, friends, and community people, and all of you. And we would like you to become members of the James Brown African American Room. Today, we have our executive board member here, Risa Dupree. She will be available in the adjacent room to sign you up. Risa, stand and let them see you, please. Risa Dupree. Thank you. Risa will sign you up to become a member of the James Brown Room, African American Room, for a small fee. Our fee for the annual dues is $35. If you don't have it with you today, just leave your information and we'll take care of that little item later. But we would like you to join us here at the African American Room so that you can participate and help us formulate our programs and our events. Our most recent program was the Kwanzaa program on December 31st, and that is available on the Newark Public Library's website. So please take a look at it and join us, become a member of the James Brown African American Room. At this time, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce the reason you're all here, to hear this great speaker. And it's Mr. Kenneth B. Morris. Mr. Kenneth B. Morris is descended from two of the most important Americans in history. He is the great great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. I knew it had to be 3. And the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. From his lineage until Providence Call, he was not involved with promoting the legacy of Frederick Douglass, but he became interested. Ken is now the president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative. It's the FDFI. It's a public charity that endeavors to create a modern abolitionist movement in school all over the country and throughout. The vehicle service learning curricula called History, Human Rights, and the Power of One. Kent's career and the path are driven by a mission to end human trafficking and all forms of servitude with a clear focus on the organization's mission, which is to advance freedom through knowledge and strategic action. In January 2012, Ken received the honorary degree of Doctor of Humane Letters from the University of Laverne. In June 2012, he received the National Park Service Network to Freedom Underground Railroad Frederick Douglass Legacy Award. And in 2014, he was awarded the Women's E-News 21 Leaders for the 21st Century Ida B. Wells Award for Bravery in Journalism. And in 2016, Ken received the Wasmuth Center for Human Rights Anne Frank Change the World Award. Ken could not have predicted that one day he would be so fully embracing and be defined by the characteristics that so closely defined his famous ancestors. Please join me in giving him a warm Newark Public Library welcome, Mr. Kenneth B. Morris.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Daniels, for that very kind introduction. I am honored to be here with you this afternoon and to talk to you about my family history, my family legacy, and this blood that flows through my veins. I have a few thank yous, and I want to recognize a few people in the audience that are friends of the work that we do at Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. And I also have some family here today. So I'd like to introduce you to the great granddaughters of Frederick Douglass and Anna Murray Douglass. Would you please stand, Faith and my cousin Zoe? They live in the area, and I descend through Frederick and Anna's youngest son, Charles, but they descend through Frederick and Anna's oldest daughter, Rosetta. And so we're cousins, and I'm very pleased and honored that you came out to see me today. Please say hello to my good friend and FDFI board member, Todd Allen. Todd, would you please stand? And also, please stand Professor Marsha Brown from Rutgers University and Chancellor Nancy Cantor. Thank you for being here. In 2018, it was Frederick Douglass's bicentennial year, the 200th anniversary of his birth. And Todd and I visited St. Benedict's Preparatory Academy to deliver 650 books to the young men there that day. And as Todd and I were driving around the city, he turned to me and he said, "Do you know if Frederick Douglass ever spoke in Newark?" And I said, "No, I don't know." And Todd loves to research. So he began to do a little bit of research, and he found out that Frederick Douglass, as we heard a little bit earlier, spoke here in Newark in April of 1849 at the Plain Street Colored Church. And he also found out that that church, which is no longer in existence, sat on the site where the Rutgers athletic field is right now. And so the Board of Governors at Rutgers University, Newark, decided that they were going to rename that field for Frederick Douglass in his honor. And so it was a wonderful thing for our family. And Todd worked with graduate student Noel Williams and determined that it was a very robust community of abolitionists that had invited him to come and speak at the church, and that there was a community of other churches and there was a school there. And so I think it's just a wonderful name. It's not every day that your ancestor gets a football field or athletic field named for them, but we're very proud and honored of that work that was done. So thank you very much. Also want to thank the Newark Public Library and all of the sponsors and partners who came together to make this Dr. King lecture happen. And thanks to all of you for coming on this cold day. And for somebody from Southern California, anything below 70 is cold to me. So, you know, I'm a little chilly. As I was introduced, I am the great-great-great-grandson of abolitionist Frederick Douglass. And I'm also the great-great-grandson of educator and founder of Tuskegee Institute, Booker T. Washington. And, you know, every time I tell people my relationship to my ancestors, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats. You imagine having, I'm the great, but it sometimes makes me feel like I'm far removed. And you might be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and to Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know a grandparent, and some of you may have known a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 102 years old. And she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. Now, she didn't know that she was going to grow up and marry his grandson, Joseph, but that's what happened. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, she lived to be 94, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on the lap of my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him, the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting at the knee of my Aunt Portia, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And when we started our work in 2007, we immediately turned to schools. And I remember one of my first presentations, I was sitting with a group of 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, and they were all looking at me cross-eyed, like, man, you are so far removed. And what does all of this history have to do with our lives today? And why are you talking about these people that lived so long ago? And so I wanted to give the students some context and help them understand and kind of wrap their minds around the distance between the generations. And I had this thought that I think was kind of profound, that hands that touch the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touch the great Booker T. Washington also touch mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand one person away from each man. I stand one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country when you consider the distance between the generations. And so what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about two men who were born into slavery. They were born into the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to, but yet through the power of education, which is a message for young people today. And I'm pleased to see a few young people here today. Now, we know from our US history, it was illegal in many places to teach an enslaved person to read and write. And so my ancestors would literally have to steal their education. And for Frederick Douglass, who became this white-haired statesman, who was the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American US Marshal, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti. Let's see, first African-American recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, and the first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor in 1899 in Rochester, New York. And they would say to Frederick, I need to know, where did you go to school? Where did you get this education? And having been a self-taught scholar and never spending one day of his life in a classroom, he would answer on occasion, my diploma is written on my back. My diploma is written on my back. And he was talking about the 20 years that he was enslaved, born into slavery with the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, and the brutal beatings and the exploitation that he had to endure and survive. My diploma is written on my back. So I have a couple of themes I'm really going to just hammer this afternoon. That first is education. And then I want to talk about this idea that history lives in each of us. History doesn't just live in me because I descend from two people that we've heard of that have some notoriety, but history lives in each and every one of you. We all stand on the shoulders and walk in the shoes of those that came before us. And for those of you that have researched your family tree, I know you found great heroes and heroines in your line, in your lineage, that may have given up their lives just for the freedoms that we do have in this country today, may have given up their lives just so that some of us even have a right today to sit here and listen to this lecture. And so think about this idea that history flows through your veins and how we can carry our history forward and to continue the work that our ancestors started, all of our ancestors. So as I mentioned, Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his enslaver was his father. Never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was around 6 or 7 years old. Used to sleep head first in an old corn sack with his feet hanging out on cold winter nights because that was the only way he could try and keep himself warm. Only saw his mother 4 or 5 times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields picking cotton from sunup to sundown, walk 12 miles in the middle of the night, and spend just a few precious moments with him until he would fall asleep. And then she would have to walk 12 miles back so she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was most likely going to face some punishment. But he did have someone early in his life that showed him some love and nurturing and care, and that was his grandmother, Betsy. Her job on the plantation was to raise the children until they were old enough to really begin their life in manual labor. And on this plantation, that was around 5 or 6. Now, you'll notice when I talk about Frederick, I have to use an age range because he didn't know his birthday. There were no records for enslaved people. In fact, the only record that mattered to his enslaver was his value, his worth on the family's accounting ledger. And so when he was around 5 or 6, his grandmother said, "Frederick, we're going to go on a long journey." And that journey was a 20-mile walk to the main plantation. Now that walk, as you can imagine, took a long time, and Frederick is scared and he's clinging to his grandmother's skirt, and she's carrying him much of the way when his legs couldn't carry himself. And she had made this walk many times before, walking the children into the gates of hell of slavery, but this was really the first time she was doing it with her own flesh and blood, her own kin. And so when they finally got to the plantation home, Frederick wanders off. He sees his house. It's bigger than anything he had ever seen before. And he just wanted to check out his surroundings and look for something to eat. And when he turned back to look for his grandmother, she was gone. He would never see her again. And so you had this little boy that only saw his mother a handful of times, didn't know who his father was. He had been separated from his 5 brothers and sisters early on. They were like strangers to him. He had no family, he had no home, and he had no country. But yet, in spite of all of that, he was able to rise up to go on to affect change in the world around him, and then to affect change for all of us sitting here today. Now, but he had divine intervention that happened along the way. When he was about 7 or 8, he was chosen from among all of the children on the plantation to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's family. Now, the importance of this move was he was leaving in an environment where he wasn't around people that could help him learn to read and write, and now he was going to be in the big city. He would be around poor white children. I see you smiling because you know what's coming up. He would be around free Black children. But when he gets there, his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, had never had a slave before. She didn't know that it was illegal to teach him. She was already teaching her young son, Tommy, how to read. And alongside Tommy was his playmate, Frederick Bailey, who was bright-eyed and eager to learn. And then this was his first act of self-liberation that isn't necessarily always talked about or written about. We always hear about the kind, Christian-hearted slave mistress who out of the goodness of her heart began to teach young Frederick to read. But what's often missing is he asked her to teach him. Did you all hear that? He asked her to teach him, and she began to teach young Fred his ABCs. And that was all he needed, was that little spark of light into his mental darkness. And the lessons continued for a little while until his enslaver found out about him, Huald. And when he found out, he got angry. And he looked at his wife and he looked at young Frederick and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave. You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." And Frederick looked at his master and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power, another message that we hear today, and that education equals freedom. Education equals liberation. Education equals emancipation. And he would teach himself to read and write. And he was very clever in the way that he went about this. Now, remember, he's interacting with the children in the neighborhood, and he would pick up chalk and scratch onto a tree, and he would say, "Is this how you write an F?" And they would say, "No, Fred, this is how you write an F." And he would file it away. He would also carry in his pocket bread, and he would trade bread or biscuits for reading lessons. In his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which was first published in 1845, he wrote in that book, he said, "I was always so hungry as a slave child. I always had this pit of hunger in my stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when I would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush, throw it into a trough similar to what pigs eat out of, and all of the children, including Frederick, would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to try to eat what little food was in there, to eat like pigs, eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He did not own himself." And so now if you think about this little boy who wanted an education so badly that he would trade something of such great importance, such great value to him, food, bread, for reading lessons. And when I talk to the young kids, they always get this right away, and they'll say, so Mr. Morris, what you're telling me is that he would rather feed his mind and have his stomach go empty. And that's exactly what he did. And he would continue to teach himself, to self-educate himself, and to read every book that he could get his hands on. He began to read the Bible. He read a book called The Columbian Orator, which was speeches to teach young boys how to be better speakers. And there were stories in there that inspired him and got him to start thinking about abolition and this idea of freedom. And so now he's growing up and he's about 16 years old. He's getting strong. He's getting better looking, because we know he was good looking, right? Oh, well, I won't repeat that. But thank you, sir. At the age of 16, what his master predicted happened. He was unfit to be a slave. And while he was not physically free from his bondage, he was on his way to becoming mentally free. So he got hired out to a slave breaker by the name of Edward Covey. And Covey's job was to break slaves. That's what he did. His job was to reduce him down to the level of a brute so that he would begin to obey again. And Covey started to whip him. And then he would whip him again. And then the beatings became more frequent. And after 6 months of taking these brutal whippings, Frederick Bailey had had enough. And he decided he was going to fight back. And again, he wrote, "There was this spirit inside of me that while I felt like I was being reduced down to the level of a brute, the level of an animal, there was something in my spirit that would not die." And he rose up and he decided to fight back. Now, they had this epic 2-hour battle, which was probably more of a wrestling match than a fisticuffs, because Frederick knew he needed to be strategic and he couldn't really go and kill this man or hurt him that badly. But after 2 hours, and if you can get this visual of this big, strong Frederick, wrestling with this guy, and they're going at it, and Covey is trying to get people, the other enslaved people that were watching and gathering around, to help. And they said, no, they don't want anything to do with Frederick. And then finally, after the 2 hours, Frederick had defeated it. And Frederick rises up and he writes later, he said, at that moment, I said to myself, you have seen how a boy has been made a slave. Now you see how a slave has been made a man. Amen. Yes. So he would continue to be with Covey for another 6 months, and Covey never laid another finger on him, never touched him for those 6 months. And remember, I said he had this reputation, so he didn't want it to get out that this young Frederick had beaten him down or beaten him back. And so Frederick now, he's walking around the plantation doing whatever he wants, probably telling Covey, will you pick that up for me? So at the age of 18, he would make his first attempt to escape from slavery. Now, I want to talk about my our great grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass, who does not get a lot of credit in this story. She has really not been treated with the dignity and respect that she deserves in history, primarily because the history has been written by white male scholars that don't see this dark-skinned Black woman who never really learned to read and write as the intellectual equal partner to Frederick Douglass. But we know that Anna was a strong woman. She was a radical freedom fighter in her own right. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad out of their house in Rochester, New York, where she helped to personally ferry hundreds of freedom seekers to their freedom in Canada after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law was enacted. She and Frederick were married for 44 years. They had 5 children together and 21 grandchildren. And people will say to me, quite frequently, they'll say, well, why didn't Frederick write about Anna? Why didn't he talk about his personal life? And my response is, what makes you think that that was his decision not to talk about his family and put them in danger? And so they were, the whole Douglass family and the 5 children were a radical freedom fighting collective. Abolition was the family business. Frederick and Anna met in Baltimore when he was a teenage boy enslaved, and she was a domestic servant working. She was the first person that was born free in her family. She had already started a business. She was saving money. Perhaps she was already helping people escape from Baltimore, Maryland. But she was one of the first people to plant the seed of thought in Frederick's mind. You're not meant to be a slave. And as they were starting to think about a future together and raising a family, she said, Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave. Had she not sold her personal belongings to help finances escape, had she not sewn the sailor's disguise that he would wear, who knows if he would have had the courage to run away or the wherewithal. And had that not happened, we would be a very different country sitting here today without the contributions of Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist and advisor to presidents, in particular Abraham Lincoln. And so Anna deserves a lot of credit. And she worked alongside him for those 44 years. And I hope that just the little bit that I've talked about her this afternoon, it will inspire you to want to learn a lot more about her. We're working with a scholar by the name of Celeste Marie Bernier, who's at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And she will have 7 volumes of books that will be published probably sometime next year called The Douglass Family Lives. It's 780 chapters. She has transcribed more than 1,100 documents and letters and papers to make the case and to show, again, that the Douglass family was this radical freedom fighting collective. 1 volume is on it, is on Rosetta. 1 volume is on Anna. Each of the children have volumes. The grandchildren have volumes. And it's just going to be a beautiful collection that's just going to change this notion in the public consciousness that it was just Frederick Douglass. We want to place him on this pedestal and venerate him for the work that he did, rightfully so, without really thinking about the support that he would have needed in order to be able to do that very difficult work. So on September 3rd, 1838, with the help of Anna, Frederick would escape his bondage by train and then by boat. He would land in New York City. He would write a letter back for Anna to come join him. 2 weeks later, they came together, they got married, they took on the name Frederick and Anna Johnson, and it was suggested by conductors on the Underground Railroad that they make their way to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Frederick could likely get work because he'd acquired a skill as a ship caulker while he was working on the docks in Baltimore. And so 2 weeks later, they would make their way to New Bedford, Massachusetts, take on the name Frederick and Anna Douglass. And because Frederick always wanted to be unique, he slapped a second S on that Douglas. So make sure you always spell his name correctly with those two S's, because that's the name that he chose for himself. So it's important, because I see it a lot of times. It's just all kind of crazy with Frederick missing an E and Douglas missing that second S. So it was really important. I'm proud of my family for a lot of reasons. But at this time, I think I'm most proud because they could have just started that family, which they did, and then live in relative freedom. He was still what we would have called a fugitive slave at that time. We call those people freedom seekers now. But he was a fugitive slave. But he and Anna both looked back and they saw that their brethren, their people, were still toiling away in slaves. And there was no way that they could live free if their people were not free. And so they would attend an anti-slavery meeting on Nantucket Island when Frederick was about 22 or 23. And the meeting was being held by the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison and the Garrisonians. And Frederick and Anna just went to sit there and listen. And when the leaders, the organizers of the event, found out that they had this fugitive slave in the audience in Frederick Douglass, they asked him, Mr. Douglass, will you just stand up and tell the audience your story? Tell them what it was like to be enslaved. And he wrote again in that first autobiography, he said, I was so nervous that first time speaking to a white audience. Now, he had honed his speaking skills in the churches in Baltimore, and he became a licensed preacher in the AME church. So he had some skills already, but this was the first time in front of a white audience. And he said, I was so nervous that I was shaking from every limb. But when he stood up, he had this natural gift for communication. He was eloquent, he was charismatic, he was theatrical. He was even funny in some of his descriptions and how he described and talked about the characters that he came into contact with. But what he was able to do for the first time was to communicate the inhumanity of the slavery that he endured and survived in a way that nobody before him had ever done. And so the Garrisonians understood that they had a star on their hands. And he became a protege to William Lloyd Garrison. And they asked him if he would join the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society as a paid lecturer. And so he now would go from town to town, city to city, just standing up and narrating the story of his life while enslaved. And they would say, Frederick, basically leave the philosophy of anti-slavery and thinking to us white men, you just tell your story. Well, he started to have a problem. And that problem, a lot of problems he had. But that first problem was people started to doubt that he was ever a slave. They couldn't wrap their minds around what they thought an enslaved person looked and sounded like, and what they were seeing in this well-dressed, good-looking man, and what they were hearing in Frederick Douglass. And so they started to call him a fraud. So in order to prove he was who he claimed to be, he wrote that first autobiography that I've been talking about, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It was published in 1845. Now he had another problem. It became a bestseller. And that's the last thing that you want, is the notoriety of a best-selling book if you're trying to hide from your enslaver. It made him a household name. It made him a celebrity, like an A-list celebrity today. People knew where he was every minute of the day. And so it was suggested that he go to Europe for a couple of years as kind of a cooling off period. And he would travel to England and Scotland and Ireland, talking about the abolition of slavery in the United States and gathering support and raising money. And then he would land in this place called Newcastle upon Tyne in England. And with the help of his abolitionist friends who raised money, he was able to purchase his freedom from his enslaver for $711, or what would have been 150 pounds, to become a free man. He would come back to the United States, move the family from Lynn, Massachusetts to Rochester, New York, where he would begin to publish the North Star newspaper, which became the leading abolitionist voice. And another point about Anna was she sent those children, their children, to work at the paper so that they could learn how to typeset, so they could further their education. It wasn't him, it was Anna. And there are descriptions in Celeste's books and papers that will be coming out that talk about, these details of the kids. My great-great-grandfather Charles, who was so young, He's sitting on a stool, typesetting, and his feet are dangling. They can't touch the floor. And he was also a paper boy with the North Star newspaper. So it was this family business. But it really became a mouthpiece for his people that were enslaved. And so it was an important paper. He would go on to become an advisor to President Lincoln, and he, along with the other abolitionists, helped to push Lincoln. And we know our Lincoln history, that he was a politician. He truly was sitting on the fence with regard to saving the Union. He said, if we could save the Union and keep slavery, I would do that. If we could save the Union and end slavery, I would do that. And so the importance of Frederick Douglass and many others to agitate, which is what I think I heard earlier when you were talking about the library and getting that reopened and contacting your local politicians and your mayors and your council people and everybody that you need to contact. That's that spirit of agitation that Frederick brought to this work. And he spoke truth to power. He had courage to do that. And so eventually Lincoln would sign the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, which that document freed those that were enslaved only in the states that were in rebellion. It did not free those that were in the border states that stayed with the Union. And so we would need the Civil War. And then, of course, the end of the Civil War, ratification of the 13th Amendment, and then the amendments that followed for slavery to be illegal. But we know that there's still a lot of work to be done. And Frederick recognized after the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, those 12 years, that there was a lot of work still to be done. Now, Booker T. Washington benefited from the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, the work that Frederick Douglass did, because he was freed when he was 9 years old. He was enslaved in Virginia. When he was freed, he wanted to go to school so badly that he worked in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia at night so he could begin his lessons during the day. And one night when he was in the mines, he heard these two older gentlemen talking about this place called Hampton Institute in Virginia. And they were talking about it as a place where formerly enslaved people could go and get an industrial education, learn a trade, learn how to do something with their hands. Now, Booker had no concept of what that kind of education meant, but what he was hearing from these two men, he thought, Hampton literally must be heaven. And he decided that he was going to go there. And at the age of 16, with the help of his community coming together to support him and to raise some funds, he would walk 500 miles to go to school there as a 16-year-old boy. Now, that walk took a long time, as you can imagine. He ran out of money on several occasions. He had to take odd jobs along the way. He slept outside. He slept under bridges. And the message there to young people with education is that there was no challenge that was going to be too great for him to overcome, no obstacle too great or insurmountable for him to overcome. And he would finally get to Hampton after that long journey, and he went straight to the headmistress of the school and said, I want to go to school here. And she looked at him. His clothes were torn and dirty. He was disheveled. And she said, young man, you are not worthy for admission to this institution. Go on about your business. Well, he wasn't going to take no for an answer. He came back the next day. She shooed him away. And he came back, and he came back, and he came back. And then finally, she said, okay, I can see that you're not going to take no for an answer. So she said, I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove yourself. There's a classroom down the hallway that's dirty, it's filthy. Go and clean that, and let's see what you could do. Well, he had learned the value of hard work, working in those mines. And now he was going to be able to put those skills to the test. And he cleaned and he cleaned. And when she came in to do that white glove test that they used to do, where you put on the glove and run your finger along the windowsills and the tables, the backs of the chairs, looking for dirt, not only couldn't she find dirt, she couldn't find one speck of dust. That room was clean, it was pristine. And she said, okay, you've proven yourself worthy of admittance. And not only that, to help you out, we're going to give you the job as a janitor so you could work your way through school. He would graduate 4 years later, come back to Hampton to teach. And then in 1881, he got word that there was a group of people down in this place called Tuskegee, Alabama, that had money to build a school for formerly enslaved people to teach an industrial education. Word got back to the group that Booker T at Hampton was the man for the job. And so he accepted. He rushed down to Tuskegee, all excited to get working. And he's looking around for an old schoolhouse or a church, someplace where he could begin lessons in a classroom type setting. But there was nothing but dirt and farmland as far as the eye could see. But he didn't get discouraged. He started recruiting students. He started to get them excited about getting an education. And then one of the first things that he taught them to do was to make bricks. He taught them to make bricks so that they could build their own school. And if you do a Google search today, you'll see students at Tuskegee out in the hot sun laboring away to build their school brick by brick by brick. That's how badly these formerly enslaved people wanted to get an education. Now, Washington understood that education at Tuskegee couldn't start with reaching for the higher aims in life. We've all heard about the debate between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and who was right. And I always like to say both of them were right. There's more than one way to go about this system of uplifting our people. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery. He came from the fields with a till under his arms. Du Bois was born free, and he came from the city with books under his arms. One worked from the bottom up, the other worked from the top down, and education and advancement for their people met in the middle. So they both were right. And so Booker said, but before we start to reach for the higher aims in life, we need to meet our basic needs. And so education at Tuskegee started with sometimes hygiene, teaching them how to tie their shoes, how to brush their teeth. But what he taught them most importantly was a trade. He would teach them how to farm the land, how to make bricks, how to make dresses, to give them a stake in the nation's growing economy. Because Washington understood, coming out of 400 years of oppression and enslavement, that in my mind, there were really two questions during slavery. You would have white abolitionists that believed that slavery was morally wrong, but some of those same abolitionists didn't believe that Black people were equal to white people. And so you had this racist ideology that Booker T. Washington understood that he wasn't going to be able to overcome just by snapping his fingers. So he showed freed Black people how they could change themselves, how they could overcome obstacles, develop strength of character, and rise by their own efforts to honorable positions of respect, but most importantly, self-esteem. So Washington was a leader who brought stability in a time of transition from enslavement to freedom. And it may be said that he's the person that bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. And so you've got Frederick Douglass, who is commonly referred to as the father of the Civil Rights Movement. He passes away on February 20th, 1895. And then Booker T. Washington takes on that mantle of leadership for his people. And so now I kind of come into the picture. And I spent all of my summers at Frederick Douglass's summer beach house, which was built by my great-great-grandfather, Charles. Charles had purchased 40 acres on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland to start a resort community for African Americans called Highland Beach. Charles and his wife had tried to get into a white resort. They were turned away. And so he decided, I'm going to buy this property and sell off the plots, the parcels. But he kept a plot for his family, for his brother Haley's family, and for his father, Frederick, to retire in. And he said to his dad, are there any special features you want built into this house? And Frederick said, yes, I want it to be right on the water. I want you to point it in this direction and build a tower at the top. And what he wanted to do at the end of his life was to sit in that tower and look back across the water, back across the Chesapeake Bay, because on the other side, you could see land. And that land is the eastern shore of Maryland, where he had been born into slavery and where he toiled away at chains. And here was a man who never wanted to forget where he came from, even though he had been born into this horrific institution. Because he understood that we need to know where we come from in order to know where we're headed. And so, unfortunately, he passed away a couple of months before the house was completed, and he never got a chance to live there. But I spent all of my summers in that house. And I would sit in that porch, and my great-grandmother Fanny would tell me about the man with the great big white hair and point across the water and say, that's where young Frederick was a slave when he was a boy, when he was your age. And in every room in that house, there were images of my ancestors everywhere, pictures. And at 5, I started to notice that they were on statues. Then I noticed that they were on money and postage stamps. And I saw schools were named for them and bridges And I remember going to a library dedication for Frederick Douglass. And I'm looking all around and I start to ask my friends and my classmates, are your grandparents on statues? They would say no. And of course, you know, the few times I told people of my relationship when I was younger, nobody ever believed me. No, you're not. And I never thought that it was a point worth arguing. And I actually spent most of my life not talking about it. But I started to notice that they had some importance. And there was this larger than life portrait of Frederick Douglass at the top of the stairs. And I remember one night walking up the stairs and looking at him and thinking, man, you look mean. And I'm glad I didn't know you. And as I would try and tiptoe or sneak past the portrait, you know what would happen? Right, his eyes would follow me. And by the time that I got down to the end of the hallway, I could feel that steely, fiery glare burning on like fire on the back of my neck. And I always imagined in my little boy imagination, this booming baritone voice, which he was said to have had, bellowing down upon my tiny person. And he would say in my mind, you will do great things, young man. And I remember thinking, who, me? Not me. I don't want anything. I don't want any part of this. Now, I didn't understand that at that time, I didn't understand that Frederick Douglass was very strategic about the way he presented himself through pictures. At the age of 22, only 2 years removed from slavery, he understands that this new technology that he would come of age with, photography, he could help to make his arguments for liberation and equality, in addition to his oratory and his writings. And so in 2015, I worked with some scholars and we published a book called Picturing Frederick Douglass. And we made the case that he was the most photographed American of the 19th century. Photographed more than President Lincoln, more than Ulysses S. Grant, more than General Custer. And his only contemporaries in the world that were photographed more than he was the British royal family. Because again, he understood that he could present himself in the way that he wanted to be seen. And when he said, you look at a photograph of me, you're going to see my humanity. You're going to look me in the eyes. You're going to see a man worthy of freedom, worthy of citizenship. And what he's also doing, he's counteracting in the public consciousness this notion that people of African descent were less than human. There were racist caricatures out there that were showing Black people with tails and as animals. And so he's changing all of that. And he's saying, look at me. And he said, when you look at a picture of me, you're never going to see a happy, amiable fugitive slave. People that were pro-slavery and people in the South, in the federal government, were saying, well, these people are an other. They're not worthy of freedom. They're not worthy of citizenship. They're better off in slavery. This is kind of a benevolent institution. They're getting the Christian religion. They're getting some level of care. They're getting fed. Listen to the happy songs that they're singing. When I talk about history, history is not just about the past, but it's also about the present and it's about the future. And for young people, stressing this importance to know where you come from and to, again, know that history lives in you and that there's greatness flowing through your veins. You see young people start to think about this idea and sit up a little bit straighter and not think about if they are descendants of people that were enslaved, that we are victims, but our people survived and endured and overcame. And there should be pride in that survival and that we're still here. And so Frederick is counteracting that notion in the public consciousness that we are worthy of freedom. And so as a young boy, when I would look at those pictures of him looking directly into the camera, I didn't understand all of that. It wasn't until many, many years later. And so this idea that I've got this greatness flowing through me, the way that the families came together happened on my mother's side. So my mother's mother, Nettie Hancock Washington, was Booker T. Washington's granddaughter. And my mother's father, Frederick Douglass III, was Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. My grandparents met in 1941 at Tuskegee. They happened to be on campus the same day. My grandmother was born in the hospital on the Tuskegee campus, but she was living in California at the time. She just happened to be home for summer vacation. My grandfather was a surgeon, and he'd been commissioned down to Tuskegee by the Veterans Administration during World War II. And my grandmother was meeting friends that day, and she was rushing across campus. My grandfather decided he was going to eat in the student cafeteria where he had never eaten before. And so if you can get this visual of him strolling and her rushing, they literally bumped into each other. Didn't know that the other descended from an historic family. They fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married just 3 months later. And so when my mom was born, Nettie Washington Douglass, and she lives in Atlanta, she was the first person to unite the bloodlines of the families. She was an only child, so I have the honor and privilege and blessing to be the first male to carry the dual lineage. So that's how the families came together, and that truly is a love story. But there's also tragedy in that story. My grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, Frederick Douglass's great-grandson, was a brilliant man. He always walked around with this weight of expectation. People expected him to be an iconic leader like Frederick Douglass. He was the namesake of one of this country's greatest and most influential heroes. And that was a heavy weight for him to carry, a heavy burden for him to carry on his shoulders. And so when my grandmother was 3 months pregnant with my mom, that weight became too much for him to carry, and he took his own life. And so my mother was raised without a father. And then when I came along with this dual lineage, my grandparents, parents, great-grandmothers went in the complete opposite direction, and they weren't going to force anything on me. So they were really kind of putting up this protective shield around me to protect me from these very formidable legacies. And consequently, because of that, I grew up really decisively disengaged from my lineage. I didn't talk about it. I didn't tell people about it. I had a principal that didn't believe me when I brought Abraham Lincoln's cane for show and tell to school. So if you think about that, your kid, you're embarrassed. You don't want to talk about it. And so I was happy to go to school and then get married. I've been married now for 38 years. I've got 2 beautiful daughters. My business was going really well. Go to church. I'm good. Don't talk to me about this Washington Douglass stuff. I don't want anything to do with it. Well, all of that changed in 2005 when I read a National Geographic magazine, and the cover story was 21st century slaves. It was a story about human trafficking and modern day slavery still existing today in every country around the world, including right here in the United States, including right here in Newark. And that article really floored me. And I wanted to learn more about what was happening with this issue. I'd heard about sex slavery in far off places like Southeast Asia. And I was reading every article I could get my hands on. And there was one night that changed the trajectory of my life when I was reading another article about a 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia and service countless men almost every single day. And down the hallway, I could hear my daughters getting ready for bed. And my older daughter, Jenna, was 12, so she was the same age as this girl that I was reading about. And my younger daughter, Nicole, was 9. And my mind just starts racing. And I'm thinking to myself, that's what young girls should be doing. They were laughing. They were about to get on their knees and say their prayers and get tucked safely into bed. And I can't wrap my brain around what I'm reading about this girl and what I'm hearing. And I remember thinking to myself, that's what young girls and boys should be doing, is getting tucked safely into bed, not being forced into bed to service some sick individual. And so I walked down the hallway into the room to say goodnight. I had this moment where I couldn't look them in the eyes. I couldn't look them in the eyes and walk away and not do something about this. And it was almost immediately that everything just started welling up inside of me. And I understood that I had this platform that my ancestors had built through struggle and through sacrifice. And perhaps I could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry to do something about this. And so I started thinking about the legacy of Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist, and the legacy of Booker T. Washington as a great educator. And this light bulb went off of my head. Abolition through education. How can we unfit communities to allow slavery to exist and thrive? Remember what I said Frederick's master said to him? Education will unfit him to be a slave. How can we bring education on this issue into the community to unfit it to survive and to thrive? And so we started the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, my mom and I, and in 2007, we immediately turned to schools and we decided we were going to do this tour called the Frederick Douglass Dialogues. And we would go into schools and talk about human trafficking. And of course, most schools, especially at that time, they were giving you the straight arm. You're not coming to talk about these very difficult issues and subject matter in our classroom. Well, then we thought, I wonder how many schools are named for Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. Well, it turns out a lot. So we were going to do 30 schools in 30 days. We wound up doing 40 schools in 30 days. All schools that were named after my ancestors. And so we got in, they opened the doors. Yes, a descendant of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. Of course, come on in. Talk about whatever you want to talk about. And so we started talking about the history of slavery in this country. And we started talking about the great freedom fighters that came before us and the sacrifices they made, the importance of education, the importance of lifting yourself up out of the community. And Frederick Douglass had a great quote. He said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." And I would add that, and women. And Booker T. Washington said, if you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else. And so when I got into the schools, I found that the students really wanted to hear about this information because they were getting a whitewashed, sanitized version of history, the same history that I got, where people of African descent and Native American descent were placed in an inferior position by design to prop up white supremacy. That was by design. And so we were not getting the true history. And now I could say that that has changed somewhat, but we still have a long way to go. We're seeing here, we're now book bans that are happening in various states. In Oklahoma, I read in September that Frederick Douglass's narrative was banned from a school district in Oklahoma. My whole life, I've had people of all ages and all races come up to me many times with tears in their eyes. And they always remember how old they were, what grade they were in when they first read Frederick Douglass's narrative or Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. And when I was younger, I never really understood the emotional connection that so many people had to my ancestors. And it wasn't until I started doing this work that a lady came up to me after a presentation, and she had tears in her eyes. And she said, "I read Frederick Douglass's narrative when I was in the 8th grade. That book made me believe that I could be and do anything possible. And I took away great inspiration from his story, his coming of age story. And if I could thank them in person, I would, but I can't. So you become the conduit to saying thank you. So can I give you a hug? Can I pinch your cheeks? Can I kiss you on the cheek? Because I want to say thank you." And so I have this perspective of how important these stories and narratives are. And it saddens me and it outrages me that these books are being banned from our schools. So when you're out there talking about reopening a library and doing the work that you're doing, we also have to be talking about the banning of books and making sure that our young people have an opportunity to learn about cultures unlike their own and to learn about people that are unlike themselves and to really understand. It fosters creativity, it fosters empathy, it fosters understanding. And so we've got to continue to work on this. So I know my time is coming to a close here. I just get really excited when I talk about this stuff. So the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, we would talk about history. We would ask the students and teachers and parents to look through the prism of history and that slavery still exists. We call it human trafficking. And when you look at historic slavery and contemporary forms of slavery and you boil down the basic elements of both, it's about exploiting the most vulnerable among us for profit, for money. And so there are millions, it's estimated that there are more than 40 million people enslaved around the world, and half of those people are children. Children like a young Frederick Douglass and a Booker T. Washington who are not in school, who are being forced to labor, who are not living very long lives because of the hard work that they're having to do every single day. And so going from school to school, we started to have students come up to us and say, well, now that I'm learning about the history of slavery and I'm learning about contemporary forms of slavery, how can I be a modern day abolitionist like a Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman? How can I communicate the inhumanity of today's slavery to my classroom, my school, my communities, my family, my churches, my organizations? And so we started to put together a curricula, service learning, civic engagement curricula called History, Human Rights, and the Power of One. The power of one came from the students and that service in the community. And that curricula has been in schools, hundreds of schools all over the country. We've had students report back to us that they've given lectures at the United Nations. They've trained law enforcement in their communities on how to recognize signs of trafficking and to treat the victims and not as the perpetrators of the crime. We've had students that have done art exhibits showing what trafficking in their community looks like around the world. They've written songs, they've written plays, just so much creativity. And what we want to inspire them and encourage them to do is to use their passion, talent, creativity, and intellect to change the world in which they live. In the same way that Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and Anna Murray Douglass changed the world. That ripple effect has touched us 150, 170 years later. What will our great-grandchildren say about us 150 years from now in this moment in which we live, where the country is as divided as it's been in a very long time, with the racist, sexist, xenophobic rhetoric that we're hearing? What will our descendants say about us? Were we on the right side of history or the wrong side of history? We've got a few projects that we're working on. Project called 1 Million Abolitionists. If they're going to ban the books from the schools, then what we're going to do and what we have done is we'll publish our own edition of Frederick Douglass's narrative. This is hot off the presses as of yesterday. And we were very fortunate to have the History Channel sponsor these first group of books. So in February, we're going to be giving away about 3,000 books to young people. We started this project with another book in 2018, Frederick Douglass's Bicentennial. And so far, we've given away over 100,000 books, including St. Benedict's Preparatory Academy. Our goal is to give away 1 million books all over the world. We're a long way from that. So we need the help from community members, from corporations, from private foundations in order to fund these books so that we can give them away. It's a great project. There's service learning curricula that goes along with it that's age appropriate in K through 12 schools. And so we have teachers that are teaching excerpts from the book. We have schools that are reading the entire book. We have schools and teachers that make it a 2-week project. Some make it a whole semester. We have one school that made it, the freshmen came in and 4 years later, they were still working on the project. So we're really proud of it. The other thing that we did is we partnered with Forefront Books and Simon & Schuster to publish a retail edition, which is going to come out in June. And that is going to be everywhere. So you'll be able to pick that up, and every book that you purchase will help us to be able to give away books. We want to, through this Frederick Douglass Books imprint, amplify the voices of Black and Brown authors. We've signed our first 2 authors. We're hoping to sign a total of 6 over the next year, but we're really excited about that project. And one of our other main projects is we are proposing to build a Frederick Douglass Museum Center in Rochester, New York. When the Douglass family moved to Rochester and published a North Star newspaper, they were there for 25 years. They were forced to leave because their house was burned down by arson. And then they moved to Washington, D.C. When Frederick Douglass and Anna both passed away, they wanted to be buried in their adopted hometown of Rochester. So they are buried at Mount Hope Cemetery. So it makes sense for us to be there. That's where our organization is headquartered, in Rochester, New York. And so we're making excellent progress on developing this world-class international museum where people can come to Rochester, learn about the lives of the Douglass family and many other freedom fighters that came before us. So those are a couple of projects that we're working on. We have a lot going on. So I will close here by revisiting what I talked about when I opened. History lives in each of us. Doesn't just live in me because I descend from these 2 great people, but it lives in each and every one of you. We stand on the shoulders and we walk in the shoes of those that came before us. We are the sons and daughters. We're the grandsons and granddaughters. Some of us are the products of slavery. This country is the product of slavery. It's also the product of the abolition of slavery. From Frederick Douglass, we learned that we have a right to be free. And from Martin Luther King Jr., we learn that as free citizens, we have the same rights of all citizens. And from Booker T. Washington, we learned how to make our way in the world as free citizens. When I was growing up, the challenges faced by great men like my ancestors were apparent to me because it just so happens their blood flows through my veins. But the fact is, all of us, we live far from the cotton fields. And we're worried more today about our favorite sports team winning a ball game on Sunday than we are about the threat of being beaten by our overseers. We live in modern times, and the echoes of slavery are hard to hear from where we stand sometimes. But if we all listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from all of the people that are enslaved today. And if we listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from all the young people out there that need hope, need inspiration. They need to know where they come from. I remember I had a 10-year-old girl say to me when we were just starting this work, she was so excited to share this with me. She's bouncing up and down in her chair and raising her hand. She said, Mr. Morris, Mr. Morris, I researched my family tree and I found that my great, four greats grandmother was born into slavery. She ran away, taught herself to read and write, and she became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist. And she knew what that word meant. And she was excited to share and proud to share it with me. And so she said, so do you know what all of this means? Before I had a chance to respond, she said, it means I have greatness flowing through my veins, just like you do. And I'll never forget that. We all have greatness flowing through our veins, and history lives in each of us. But the future depends on how we carry that history forward. I was born in Washington, D.C., and as I mentioned, I spent all my summers in Frederick Douglass's Summer Beach house, but I also had an opportunity to go to the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C. It's where he spent and lived the last 17 years of his life. And we used to go on field trips to that home. And I loved a couple of rooms in the house, the library on the first floor. And when you go there, and if any of you have been there, you'll know what I'm talking about. There are thousands of volumes of books from the ceiling to the floor. And I remember thinking to myself, never spent one day of his life in a classroom, but that's where he got his learning, his knowledge, his education. But my favorite room was upstairs and down the hallway, and that's his bedroom. And you know how when you go into a museum, they a lot of times will have that velvet rope that blocks off the rooms so you can't touch anything or sit on the furniture. So from the hallway into his bedroom was one of those ropes. And I remember being a little boy, and I always wanted to see what was in that room. And so I would stick my neck over the rope so I could see inside the room. And if I looked to my left, I could see his bed. And on his bed is his nightshirt. And next to the bed is a chair. And the hat he used to wear as Consul General to Haiti is on that chair. And next to the chair on the floor is a pair of his shoes. And I always wanted to sneak past that rope to try those shoes on. And so when we started our organization, the first talk I ever gave was in the visitor center at that home. And there was a group of about 25 people, 35 people, or teachers and parents and students. And I told that story. And when I finished the presentation, the site manager of the home said, I've got a great idea. Let's go on a special VIP tour. So we ran up the hill. The house sits on a hill called Cedar Hill. And if you sit on the porch in the rocking chair, you can look in the distance. You can see the Capitol Dome, the Washington Monument. And I always think to myself, this little boy was born into slavery and look where he ended up. Not because of the materialism of it and the big house and all of that, but just this idea that anything was possible and he was able to achieve it. So we're running up the hill because I know where we're going. But first I wanted to show the kids the library. So I'm knocking the kids over because I want to get in there first so I could show them all of the books. And I say, follow me, follow me. So we run up the stairs and down the hallway, there's that rope that's been staring at me for 40 plus years now. And the site manager did something they'd never done before. She took the rope down, said, come on in. So we all rushed in. I'm excited now. And the room was not very big, so 35 of us were kind of squished together. And then there was a group photographer that wanted to take a picture of us all. And so he started placing people and he said, you go here, you go over here, and you go here, and why don't you stand here? And when he got to me, Do you know where he put me? Did you say in the shoes? Now that visual, like just pick me up and put me in the shoes. Put me right next to the shoes, stand there. So I'm like this, and we're like, shoulder to shoulder. And I looked down and I said to myself, there they are. After all of these years, all I would have to do is just slip off my shoes and I could step right into them and nobody would ever know. And I'd be standing there, look at me, taking pictures in Frederick Douglass's shoes, finally. But I never did. I know. I never tried those shoes on because I knew that they wouldn't fit. Those shoes are too big for any of us to fit into. But what I realized at that moment was that I could take the shoes that I've got. You all could take the shoes that you got, and we can lead the way to a brighter future. We can lead the way to a better tomorrow. And just like Frederick Douglass, Cesar Chavez, Susan B. Anthony, pick your freedom fighter of choice, we can go on and affect the world in which we live, and therefore 150, 170 years from now, affect the world for the people that come after us. And so with that, I thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of your afternoon. Thank you to the Newark Public Library. It's been my honor to have an opportunity to talk about my family and our work today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Got you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Morris, for this rich and inspirational discussion. We just wanted to, maybe with your blessing, of course, open up the floor for about maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes.
Sure. Yeah.
Questions. So anyone who may have any questions, I will actually bring the mic around to you. Take it off here, and, or come more line behind me. And if anyone needs assistance, I can bring the mic to you.
Dr. Burrell, would you mind?
Statement. All right. Oh, Jim, so right behind. All right, come on up.
How you doing, sir?
Doing well, thank you.
Good. My name is Eric Adams, not the Adams of New York. That's a distant cousin, but that's another story. But I have a book here of the narrative of Frederick Douglass, which was a very important item in my household. It taught me that I could teach myself a business and become very successful. After all, Frederick Douglass had taught himself to read. And I used many of the same techniques. You know, I worked on Wall Street and I wanted to learn how to trade securities and learn how to trade futures, crude oil, all those kinds of things. And I would ask questions of the brokers and the broker dealers, and I learned how to do it. And I became pretty successful at it. So I just wanted to, at the end, when you're finished talking with everyone, if I could get your signature on my book. This is a very important book. Very important. Okay? And thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. I would be very honored to sign that for you, and thank you for proving my point that people come up to me all the time to say that the narrative has changed their lives, and happy to hear about the success that you've had in business, and perhaps you might want to help us get these books into the hands of more students so that they can be blessed and inspired like you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming here. I'm very grateful to hear your story. I remember in high school, we as people of color, we fought very hard to get an African-American class, and we were unsuccessful, but we did get Jesse Jackson to come to our school in 1984 to speak. And so that's the fruition of our fight. But I did get to learn about your ancestors in college, and I did get the autobiography for a class. And my question is, have you ever gotten a chance to develop a formula for success in getting some relief to the victims via the Victims Relief Fund that most police departments have. Have you been able to develop some trick? Because a lot of people can't get relief. It's just a red tape. And I was wondering if you were able to discover anything.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any secrets to share on how to be able to do that. Our organization is a nonprofit. We're a 501c3. So we're out there constantly trying to raise money and find grants to be able to support the work that we do, which is primarily human trafficking prevention education work. We also do work around racial equity in communities. A lot of our work starts really kind of with legislation. So when we introduced our human trafficking prevention education program online, which is now where it resides. We're in 10 different states now. We're expanding internationally with a program called Protect, which trains educators on how to recognize signs of human trafficking, how to intervene, and get certified to teach an age-appropriate curriculum in the classroom. And we were able to get a couple of pieces of legislation passed in California to mandate that students have to get human trafficking education once in middle school and once in high school. Our programs go far beyond that, but that's a start. We were also able in 2018 during the bicentennial year to work at the federal level to pass the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act. That was a reauthorization of the first piece of anti-trafficking legislation, which was first enacted in 2000. And that was called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. That legislation we felt was flawed because it only addressed what happened after the victimization occurred. Organizations would come in and rescue and restore and rehabilitate. Law enforcement would come in and arrest and prosecute the perpetrators. And as well-meaning as all of the organizations that were doing and are doing very good work, as well-meaning as they were, it was creating this cycle of exploitation where we were just rescuing, restoring, and rehabilitating victims, which is very costly to a community, not to mention the cost and trauma of trying to get a young person who's had their childhood stolen away from them to get them back to some semblance of wholeness. So we felt like if we could interject primary prevention and stop new victims from being spewed into that cycle of exploitation, we might make some progress. And so when that legislation, the TVPA, was reauthored, we were able to insert that one word, prevention, into the title, and then followed prevention language. And once that happened, we were able to get $78 million appropriated through the Department of Health and Human Services to go to primary prevention education in the classroom. So saying that, all that to say, that's not really answering your questions, but you have to be very strategic in the way and creative in the way that you go about doing some of these things in your community. All of this work really starts at the local level. Frederick Douglass had his voice, he had his pen, and eventually he had his vote. And we all have our voices, and maybe need a metaphor now, we have our keyboards, and hopefully all of us have our votes. And so it starts at the local level, and demanding that our politicians look at policies that perpetuate systemic racism that exists in all of American life throughout all of the institutions, demand that those policies are recognized and changed. And if they don't do that, then we vote in new people that will. I think sometimes we become complacent in our communities and think that our one voice doesn't matter. And it really does. I've seen that it does. So I would just say that identify, what it is that you're looking to try and accomplish, what are the challenges and what's preventing this from happening, and then try and bring people together, organize, and agitate, agitate, agitate. Thank you.
Hi, how are you? My name is Nawari Burge. I'm an adjunct professor at King University, as well as County College. Grew up here in this library and was invited here by the librarian, Reggie. and he said someone was going to be speaking in regards to Frederick Douglass. So I'm also an award-winning independent documentary filmmaker. And so I've been doing all these projects and decided to do a piece on Black beaches. So I went out to Bruce's Beach in LA,
Yeah.
found out about Amelia Island, went down to Chickabone Beach here in Atlantic City, connected to Sag Harbor, and interviewed William Pickens, and said, I cannot find anyone to interview in regards to Highland Park Beach. I had no idea you were going to speak on it. So
Yeah.
I would love to meet with you and speak with you about that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for coming, and we'll exchange information. I'd be happy to talk to you about Highland Beach. The who's who of the Black community had houses there. They were there. It was an incredible place and still is. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mars. My name is Arlene Warner. I'm a recent graduate of Rutgers North.
Congratulations.
Thank you. My degree is public and nonprofit administration. My focus is affordable housing and economic and community development. I'm a relatively recent learner of Frederick Douglass. I saw an opera that the North-based Trilogy Opera Company did a few years ago, pre-COVID. My English professor here, Professor Lionel Winter, he assigned the reading about him learning to read in that process that you talked to us about. So I was really inspired by it. So I got the book in the library, in the bookstore. The other thing is that when you said we all have history in us, and I've learned that one of my relatives was a Buffalo Soldier. I've learned that also on my grandmother's side, on her father's side, his brother may have been in Tulsa, Oklahoma in mass, because after that point, they never heard of him. One of my pet peeves is that the voting rights bill could have been gutted the way it was in the first place. People died so that we could vote. But I want to tell you how excited I was to be here, to be there when the bill was dedicated. Because when I read the announcement and I saw your two answers to your legacy, all I could say to myself was, wow, that is really something. One more thing, I'm an avid Jeopardy fan. So recently he was the subject of a Final Jeopardy.
And did you get the answer right?
Absolutely.
Well, congratulations on your graduation, and thank you very much for sharing that with me.
I have two unrelated statements. One of them is I'm a volunteer at the New York Museum. I've been there over 12 years volunteering. And on Monday, we're going to have our Martin Luther King Day. So get your grandchildren out there. It's important to learn your history.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two, I've made it a point to make sure that I can get to as many historical sites as I can during my lifetime. And the reason why I'm here today is because I want to tell you a quick story. Let's say today I try to go to Frederick Douglass's house. I don't remember what year it was, but I couldn't find the place. 10 years later, I found the place, and little did I know, it happened to be July the 5th. And what was going on that day was that there was a camera crew that had a man speaking and looked like Frederick Douglass, and I actually got to see it. And the whole thing about it was I had no clue of that day until that moment when I happened to wind up going there. Now, I just want to say one other little part. Throughout the years, I've made a point. I've gone to Tuskegee. I've gone to the Tuskegee Institute, the Tuskegee Airmanship, and where Book 2 Washington was, and Washington.
George Washington Carver.
Right. And the thing is that all these years, I've been grabbing little pieces of places to go, historical sites. There's so many out there that people don't realize what's out there, and they need to get out there. And you can get the National Park Services. You can pay a minimal fee and visit all the parks. That's it. I just want to tell you, thank you. And that's the reason why I'm here.
Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing that. And you reminded me that I failed to mention that Frederick Douglass Field is now part of National Park Service's Network to Freedom. It was, an application was submitted and accepted finally, and it now is a recognized site on the Network to Freedom and the Underground Railroad tour. So that's congratulations to the Rutgers folks and the Douglass family for that. And then July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass's famous "What to the American Slave is Your 4th of July" speech was delivered in Rochester, New York at Corinthian Hall in front of 600 anti-slavery supporters, and Frederick laid it on them. These were his friends. And he was talking about the hypocrisy of a country that would espouse the ideals of freedom, justice, liberty, and equality for all while enslaving people of African descent on its blood-drenched soil. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? Everything, this is yours, not mine. Do you mean to mock me by inviting me to speak here today to talk about this? And I think it's one of the greatest speeches, if not the greatest speech in American history. For those of you that have not read it, I encourage you to read it. You will be inspired. And he also talked about, the hypocrisy of a Christian nation. And many of the things that he talked about, we're still dealing with today with regard to, I'm not going to get into a religious conversation, but when Frederick Douglass was enslaved as a boy and he started to think critically about his condition of enslavement, and he said, "Why am I a slave? Why do you own me?" And he would turn to God and he would pray to God for deliverance from his bondage. And he would say, "God, I don't understand how my master puts on a suit every Sunday and goes to church, and then the word and the Bible and cherry pick scriptures and verses finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, and plunder his property." As the little boy, he's already starting to make the distinction from what he would call the slave-holding Christianity of the land versus the pure, peaceable, partial Christianity of Christ. So that speech, he calls out that hypocrisy, but as he always did, he always ended on a note of hope. And he said that the country at that time, I think, was 77 years old, and we can do better. We're still a new country. He recognized that there's a lot of work still to be done. If Frederick Douglass were here today, who knows what he would say or do, but because his blood flows through my veins, I'll tell you what I think. He would be pleased to see that we have made some progress as a nation. We elected an African-American president, most recently a female vice president of color. He would be pleased, I think, to see that progress, but I also think that he would be outraged to know that there's still so much work to be done. And unfortunately, I say unfortunately, his words are as relevant today as they were all of those years ago. And it's unfortunate, but thank goodness we have the words of Frederick Douglass as our guide. Let history be our guide. Thank you for sharing.
Mr. Morris, first of all, thank you so much for being here this afternoon here in Newark and bringing Frederick Douglass's legacy, and not only his legacy, but his persona, him as a man, bringing him alive, to life in such a compelling and vibrant way, like you have done. Thank you so much for that, first of all.
Thank you.
I also wanted to ask you, I know that Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony had a very, very long friendship. And
complicated at times.
And I was going to say, and that was also difficult, with many differences. So I was just wondering if you had a little bit of information to share with us about that particular relationship.
Yeah, well, Rochester is, as I mentioned, the adopted hometown of Frederick Douglass and the Douglass family, but it's also Susan B. Anthony territory too. And if you go to, there's a park there that has a sculpture called Let's Have Tea. And it's Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony sitting together to symbolize their friendship and the work that they did together. That was a complicated relationship, of course, because of the 15th Amendment and voting rights. And that's a whole nother lecture. But yeah, they were friends. And in the same way that Lincoln and Douglass were friends, Douglass was very critical of Lincoln, as he should have been at many points during his presidency. And that cane that I mentioned that I brought to school, when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Mary Todd Lincoln gave that cane to Frederick Douglass as a token of appreciation of their friendship. And it was in my family for many years, and it was passed down in the family My great-grandmother, Fanny, donated it to the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site a number of years ago. So if you go to the visitor center, you'll see that cane in a case, a plexiglass case. So he had a lot of relationships that were complicated over the years, but the work was hard. You know, it was hard.
Well, thank you about talking about the cane, because I was going to ask you, how did you wind up with the cane in your
Yeah.
school with the, but thank you for explaining that as well.
Yeah, I asked my mom, I have show and tell that my teacher wants me to bring something, all of the students to bring some artifact or family heirloom and talk about your family. And so I asked my mom, well, what should I bring? And she runs into the bed. Well, this is being recorded, so I won't tell you where she keeps the artifacts, but she comes out with this cane and she said, take this. And I said, well, what is that? She said, that's Abraham Lincoln's cane. I said, Mom, people don't even believe me when I say that I'm related to Frederick Douglass. And you want me to go to school and tell my classmates and my teacher that this is Abraham Lincoln's cane? She said, go on, you'll be all right. I wasn't all right.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. I wanted to say that a special thank you for coming to us in Newark. I am a person who for over 40 years, I have taught in companies and training organizational development. I was trying to be retired, but then I got called to teach in one of our high schools here. So I predominantly focus on our young men. My high school is predominantly Black and Latino. So I'm very interested in them. It's a challenge every day. Every day I come home tired, need to take a little break. But I just wanted to know from you, what would be the next best steps going forward? Anything come to mind? Because today I came to just learn our history and feel good about this weekend. And now I am motivated to get back in
Good.
there. So I want, I talk to the young men all the time. They call me grandma. I hug them every day that I see them. So I just wanted to know what would be the next best steps for me to share with those people, young people.
I would go back, and the first question I would ask the young men is, do you know who Frederick Douglass is? Do you know who Booker T. Washington is? And you might be surprised to find out that they might not know. That's not uncommon for even adults. You know, people know the name. Some may know a little bit about his story, but they don't really understand, his importance to our country. And I would just start with the education. And for all of the educators that are in here that share these stories and teach about this history, thank you. On behalf of the Douglass and Washington family, thank you when you teach about the legacies of my ancestors, because that helps. I know that it will inspire a young person to want to learn more and to, again, believe that they can be and do anything possible. And so I would just start with the basics and then just start teaching them what you know, what you learned today. Yeah.
Thank you for your legacy. Thank you for coming to Newark. So great, so inspirational that I put at risking my Seahawks versus 49 San Francisco football game. And
I wasn't talking to you.
and 3 things in 2 minutes. Can we ever forget Frederick Douglass? As a slave, what does your 4th of July mean to me? And when we think of Dr. King, we have to understand that when he opposed the Vietnam War, he was unpopular, came to Newark unpopular, but he was unwavering in his principles and what he believed in. Thank you for reminding us again of the Negro National College Fund theme, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. And because I'm so inspired by your message, through Dr. Nasser Ahmad and the James Brown American Room, I want to pledge from my foundation as you begin to distribute the books and create the books and create this importance of an education of $1,000 through or not to the James Brown Room. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That will allow us to do hundreds of books. And thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind comments. And I just wanted to just quickly touch on a couple of things that you said that remind me of Dr. King and how so many people revere him today, but during his time, exactly. And Uncle Tom is what, they would call him among a lot of other things. Again, we have the benefit of looking back through the prism of history and looking at the totality of their work. And I think about present day freedom fighters that speak truth to power. When Frederick Douglass gave that speech, the 4th of July speech, he was not liked very well. He was called a traitor. He even said at times, I have no love for my country. He demanded that his country do better, and he had a love-hate relationship with his country. And a lot of people want to take his legacy and only focus in on certain parts of some of the things that he said when he was talked positively about the founding fathers as being wise men, but oppression makes a wise man mad. I think of somebody like Colin Kaepernick, who is doing exactly what Frederick Douglass did. He's demanding that his country do better. And he lost his career, his football career over it. And look at the way that some of the American public has demonized him and treated him. And he will be on the right side of history. We know that for those people that look back. So thank you for bringing that up. Thank you very much for the contribution pledge. We really appreciate that. Thank you, sir.